Reddit, what's the worst culture shock you've ever had while traveling? I went from a dry country, Australia, to Ohio and found that everything is green. If you need water, you just dig a hole in the ground. Took me a second there. On first reading I thought you meant dry as in alcohol free and I was very confused. I once saw a mob crush a man's head with a motorcycle battery because he had been caught trying to steal said battery. The cops just watched him getting beaten, run over, and finally bludgeoned. East Africa is a scary place sometimes. Oh, yeah, I mean, we got our house robbed once and our guardian called over all the guards from the neighborhood. It was a freaking manhunt. They had tree roots for bludgeons. I kid you not. If they'd found the guy, he was dead. We fervently hope they wouldn't find him. Barefoot people everywhere in New Zealand. In Starbucks, in the mall, on public transit, walking down the street. No shoes, no socks, no fricks to give. Silly hobbits. Truck playing music while driving down streets of Taipei. I commented that it might be an ice cream truck. My host looked at me funny and replied, that's the garbage truck. If we want ice cream, we go to the 7-Eleven store. Haha. I went to Taipei in November and my brother and I were also wondering why there was an ice cream truck. Nope, just a garbage truck blaring out furries to let people know that they were coming by to pick up the trash. I went to Greece this past January and we went into this little t-shirt shop. The lady asked where we were from and we said Chicago since it was the closest to where we actually were. She then goes, I've always wanted to go to Chicago. I love black people. Had no idea how to respond to that. This is not as good a story as a lot of these here. Just saying up front. I live in the Netherlands. Water is all around me. From the sea, to the canals, to waterways dividing the fields between different farms. The first time I visited Iowa and drove around there, it took me a couple of days to realize there wasn't any water between the fields and acres. Sure, there's a river and whatnot, but essentially it's just endless actual ground. It made me feel uneasy for a couple of minutes. Iowa, every foreigner's vacation destination. I am an American living in the poorest province in China and I have been thanked repeatedly for dropping the atomic bombs on those Japanese monkeys. I have also spoken to someone who believes that all black people have AIDS and they are responsible for spreading it to the rest of the world. I moved from the US to Moscow. The first 2 weeks were an absolute nightmare since Moscow is about 18x larger than my home city. My favorite culture shock experience is on my second day getting lost in the train system for hours. The train system, as amazing and efficient as it is, you can get lost for days if you don't know it. The Moscow metro is so horrifying they made a game and book series on it. I joke. Okay, so in Norway, where I'm from, social anxiety is integrated in our culture. We don't talk to strangers unless we have to. We're never unnecessarily polite. Even the people working in stores won't talk to you unless you ask for it. Look lost. So when I came to New York and the people working in stores asked me how I was completely floored. Not only did they talk to me the second I came in the door, they actually asked me how I felt. I got so freaked out I ended up avoiding stores altogether until I built up the courage. Took me like 3 days. Even then, going into a store was super stressful to me and I almost always ended up blushing and stuttering instead of saying fine thanks. How are you? To which they just didn't reply. So weird. Wasn't sure how antisocial you meant. Then you said people in NYC were polite. That's a pretty low baseline. Moved to and started driving in Poland. Everyone drove as if the speed limit signs were in imperial rather than metric. Then I went on a trip to India, Calcutta, and I saw real driving. When I returned to Poland I realized that Polish traffic is way more insane than it ought to be, but not really insane. We act like our speed limits are more what you'd call guidelines than actual limits. Back when me and my family flew to America my first time, we landed in Houston to switch planes and went to a fast food diner in the airport. I ordered a milkshake and not only was it served in a cup that was like twice my size, they also gave me the shaker in which it was made so no ice cream is left behind. At that moment I was assured I was gonna love America. Went on a school trip from the UK to the US as a kid and it was the first time any of us had been there. It was a hot day in DC. My friend ordered the largest soda he could. We'd never seen anything like it. He was carrying this giant bucket around all day in both hands and always looking for a bathroom. The Chinese toilets that are just holes in the ground. It is even worse in the countryside, where there are no walls and you just don't look at each other when squatting. And everything falls in this smelly ditch underneath where you can actually see all the poop. That's not just small towns. You can find wall-less bathrooms in the major cities as well. Been in one in Beijing and Shanghai. It's extra weird when your knees rub against the guys next to you. What is with American toilet stalls having the doors end like 2 feet away from the ground? Every time I took a crap I was half expecting to see someone poke their head under because of how much space there is. And sometimes little kids do exactly that. I was in Germany a couple years ago with a friend of a friend who was born in the Soviet Union and who still lives in a former Soviet satellite. Someone tried to get us to sign a petition. After the guy left, I had to explain the concept of a petition and he said, "Oh, in my country if you want to change the government you just disappear." Flashbacks to 1984. I'm currently living in Japan, originally from the US. The store employees. I knew that they're known for being very polite and following specific, set codes of conduct, but honestly I was so shocked at first. When I arrived I had to wait in the airport mall for my bus, and I just sat there for over an hour watching them. One sales lady was passing out food samples. She stood outside the store and called out a scripted sales pitch, gestured, smiled, and bowed. Exactly the same words, exactly the same intonation, exactly the same pattern of gesture, smile, bow, over and over and over. It was like watching a robot. Even her eye movements and the way she moved were very stiff and machine-like. People completely ignored her, making it seem even more like she was just an object. Eventually I went over to get a sample from her and she was quite nice and talkative. Just a regular lady doing her job. But until she snapped out of the sales lady script it was almost terrifying. Not all salespeople are so extreme but they do follow specific, set scripts and they basically expect customers to either completely ignore them or give short, almost curt sounding replies. When I spoke to them using polite level speech, bowed back, etc., they would get pretty upset. They started using extremely polite speech and bowing really low, like they were horrified that I wasn't talking down to them. Eventually I figured out that it was actually rude of me to be too polite, or at least my idea of polite. It was embarrassing to them. It really drove home to me that sometimes your gut reaction of what's the right thing to do can be completely wrong. Feudal Japan is still strong in mannerism, politeness and being Japanese. But Korea also got the old-aged position over actual experience sort of reverence. If you're older you're automatically respected by the younger generation in speech and conduct. Inside they are probably just as annoyed as you and me though. It's probably a stupid thing but being from Australia and visiting Europe I was shocked that to use public toilets you have to pay. I'd agree with it in principle that it helps with upkeep, cleaning etc. However almost every one we used were filthy and definitely not looked after. Even worse I found were the ones with the old women sitting at the entrance who'd yell at you if you couldn't find enough coins to appease her. Also interesting that even places like train stations and shopping centers do this. We were floored when we finally found the only toilet that was open to the public at the McDonald's opposite checkpoint Shady in Berlin. Made our freaking day. I was traveling with toddler and a middle-aged woman ergo the obsession with needing toilets. This is just a thing in silly southern Europe, Germany. They're insane about toilets there for some reason. Come to Scandinavia where we don't charge people for basic human needs like taking a crap. When I went to London, all the faucets in all the public bathrooms had handles so you could turn the water on and off like a freaking adult, and all the stall doors went all the way to the floor. Went to Egypt last summer. We had hired a personal tour guide because there was no way we would be walking around by ourselves in Egypt. The service came with an Egyptian government security guard to protect us. And at one point my mother asked our tour guide, not the guard, what he thought of the government right then, and he said it was great. Later when the guard was getting us into a site, the tour guide told my mom not to ask questions like that in front of the guard because he, the tour guide, could be punished for talking negatively about the government. Really scared me. After traveling wide and far, be very wary of talking about politics or religion, unless it's naturally part of the conversation. Being treated like a minor celebrity for being white in some parts of Asia. Having random strangers come up to me to tell me that I am so handsome, both men and women. Having nearly everyone I interact with try to set me up with their daughter's friends themselves. So in Italy, being a server at a restaurant is a respectable career, and they are paid pretty well. It took me way longer than I would have liked to figure out why all the wait staff I came across was very grateful for my 15% tips. The US North America is pretty much the only place in the world where tipping is mandatory or expected as far as I know. Pay your goddamn employees. On my first day in Tokyo, spending an entire train journey with two small girls, probably 4 or 5 years old, staring at me inches from my face like they had never seen a white guy before. The mother looked terribly embarrassed but didn't try to stop them. Queuing up in a shop and being asked to stand in a different line where there was a white guy that spoke English at the counter for that line. Discovering that Japanese pavements get dangerously slippery when it's been raining because of how clean the pavements are. There's no friction at all. Going into a trendy cafe in Shibuya that was blasting out incredibly vulgar gangster rap music during the middle of the day. The lyrics were in English, so I guess that the owners of the cafe didn't know how inappropriate it was. I think it's more that I culture shocked somebody else. My husband, then boyfriend, and I went to stay with his mom's cousin in Argentina. They had a sort of live-in housekeeper who cleaned and took care of their disabled son. But I didn't really know what all of her duties entailed. Why would I need to? We woke up earlier than she did one day, walked to the store on the corner and bought some eggs, and went home and made ourselves some fried egg sandwiches. Apparently, in Argentina, it's 1. Totally weird to eat eggs for breakfast, and 2. Completely weird to make your own breakfast that you want rather than waiting for this other person to serve you the breakfast she wants to make. This trip was like 5 years ago and the family still talks about the time the American cousins made their own eggs for breakfast. That's only wealthy people. It happens in Chile too. Chatting to a tuk-tuk driver we retained to stay with us in Cambodia. We asked him, "What do you do in your free time?" He said, "What you mean?" We said, "What do you do when you are not driving your tuk-tuk?" He said, "What you mean? I sleep." The fact that the concept of any free time at all was alien to him made me seriously realize my privilege of birth. Sobering. Rio de Janeiro. The small children selling gum on busy streets all day and night. The beggars everywhere. Every building had bars on the windows. Armed guards at the doors of the hotel. The enormous shanty towns on the mountainsides. Traveling on business, and it's the only place my boss insisted I have a driver. For safety reasons. While I was there, the beaches were robbed. A line of robbers from the water's edge to the street behind, and it was a wide beach. Basically went from one end to the other, a mile, and robbed everyone there. Hundreds of people. Also the inflation rate was so high my dollars were worth noticeably more. 15% by the end of the week. And the dollar was definitely the preferred currency, even for large commercial events like my conference. On the plus side, the people as a whole were beautiful and wore almost no clothes. Small bikinis, no matter your age or sex. Bikinis were not unusual all over the city, sometimes wrapped in Paris. I don't know where people kept their money. No one carried purses. I was told that was because they'd be stolen. In Beijing, old fat men do this thing called the Beijing bikini, where they tuck the bottom of their t-shirt into the neck to expose their gut. It wasn't exactly a shock, but it was hilarious. They also let their kids crap on the floor. I got off a long-haul flight from New Zealand via Singapore at Heathrow and watched a bunch of security guards carrying more firepower than our entire police force. That was an eye-opener for sure. Going from having never seen more than a .308 rifle to having these guys stroll past was unsettling. Airport security are basically the only police in the UK that have guns, apart from special armed response units. Tall white guy from Chicago. Went to Mexico City to practice my Spanish and visit the pyramids of Teotihuacan. Everywhere I go, children and teenagers would run up and ask if they could take a picture with me. By the third day it was explained to me what was going on. The kids who are in English language classes get extra credit for engaging in a conversation with a native English speaker, and they have to have photos or video on their cell to prove it. In Mexico they encourage their young children to approach strangers in public. Apparently, they don't seem to have an equivalent Nancy Grace. Meeting countless folks in Honduras that had no running water or electricity at home. Expected. Then finding out they owned cell phones and laptops. I was in UK on work experience program from Czech Republic, and I was told to be always polite, that British are very strict about good customs. People that were exact opposite of what we've been taught. They didn't give a dang about greetings and good manners. People were very open-hearted and told you literally everything that's been on their minds. Cashiers in supermarkets would sometimes try to initiate conversations. I got complimented on my long hair and other things. One of them was curious about my accent and treated me for a cup of coffee after the shift. On the other hand, they were apologizing for almost everything. A lot of times I just evaded other people on streets and they apologized. It almost drove me mad. As a Canadian, I fail to see what's wrong here. LOL. Billboards while driving through the States. I'm from Canada. Good lord, nowhere in Canada would you see a billboard that says Jesus would keep the baby. The women in the Caribbean were much more flirtatious and forward than back home. It made me super nervous. I had a girl approach me in a Wendy's of all places and ask if my friend and I would like to join her and some friends at the beach. My buddy and I keep arguing about whether they were H and we were going to get drugged and mugged. Nope, just some teachers who thought we were attractive. That happened multiple times over the years, and practically never happens in the US. I can count on one hand the amount of times I've been approached by a woman while on American soil. Anytime I go abroad, especially to the Caribbean, it happens multiple times. I still don't understand. Time to book my tickets, I guess. Going to Dr. Congo where police walk around the streets with what appear to be AK-47s. The traffic is essentially lawless and you'll have piles of traffic 3-4 cars wide attempting to merge into a single lane because everybody is trying to pass each other using the footpath and the opposing traffic lane. The electricity in the city can be only on in certain areas for a few hours in the dead of night because there's not enough supply and it gets diverted to the city center during the day and evening. If you are of certain races, for example, white Indian, you are considered rich by virtue of your skin tone regardless of how much money you actually have. Wasn't really a shock for me because I knew before I visited that this is what it is like, but it could be a great shock for somebody who's not prepared for it. A very different place to Australia. When I went to Italy with my family and learned that all restaurants and most businesses are closed on Sundays. Being a hick from the US, that blew my 13-year-old mind. Little girl in Bangkok selling animal figures made out of palm leaves or grass for about 12 hours. When I was 6 we moved to America for a year, so every morning we had to do the Pledge of Allegiance, and because I was from Germany I had no idea what it was, so I acted like I knew what I was doing. I live in America, and a lot of people have that. This is kind of creepy realization around 8th grade, when they become teenagers. Once you get to high school, a lot of people stand, but don't say it, or continue working on schoolwork while the pledge is said over the loudspeaker. I think as the years go on, less and less people will actually say it, but that's just a prediction. When I was about 21 I went for my first trip outside Europe. It was also my first plane ride. It was a work placement in Nigeria. I was out in the middle of nowhere doing some survey work for oil. There were many culture shocks. Everything was fascinating and partly intimidating. And for the most part during the day it was me in the jungles, villages or swamps with the locals. The culture shock came for me when I was driving back at the end of the day, after having been there for a month or so, and I saw another white guy driving in the opposite direction on the road. It was the first unknown and the wild white guy I had seen for weeks. The culture shock thing for me was that his face, sitting there in the passenger seat of a Land Rover, looked almost non-human, like a fat pink pig. It was like I could momentarily see white people through the eyes of the villagers, having not seen one for so long. I still see that similarity when I look at a picture of Vernon Dursley in the Harry Potter movies. His face, sitting there in the passenger seat, That phrase conjured up a very grotesque image. Ordering iced tea in a restaurant in America. In Canada, when you order iced tea, you get what Americans call sweet tea. Unsweetened iced tea is basically not a thing in Canada. At least, I have never seen it. Imagine my surprise the first time I ordered iced tea in America expecting a sweet drink. Yeah, this really matters where you are. A lot of areas in the South would give you 99% sugar sweet tea if you asked for an iced tea. I was an American white woman living in Vietnam, and I made friends with a Vietnamese woman who could speak English. We were talking about our situations growing up, and I told her about how mine was pretty crap. Abusive parents, constantly sick, constantly hungry, etc. She was in no way trying to best me when she said the following. She just calmly told me the story about how her family kept trying to talk her into being sold into marriage or prostitution so her brothers could get a better education. Turns out that's a very common practice for rural Vietnamese families. Now, my life growing up was pretty crap, but never once did my family try to sell me into the sex trade. It really put things into perspective and made me thankful for how good even the worst of times were for me. I just went to a Thai wedding. At one point, a very drunk middle-aged obese woman was thrusting a wooden phallus in my face while walking the groom, whose name I don't know, down a highway holding an umbrella to keep the sun off of him. Visited Gatlinburg, Tennessee to see the Great Smoky Mountains. I'm Canadian and it was like a living stereotype. I was there around the time of some political event involving the Confederate flag, so they held a flag rally in the city. It was this massive line of giant pickup trucks with the Confederate flag on top. It was weird, but even weirder is that there were people with pistols in holsters on their belt. I'd never seen a gun that close before, and they were just walking around with that. Yay, that's America in Republican Outback. The funny TV show On a Plane to Saudi Arabia where the guy beats his wife for back talking him with a shoe. Same trip the military trade show in Abu Dhabi. Some next level shady crap. But what the frick? I, an American, lived in Germany for several years in college. They have an obsession with fresh air, which mostly I loved. However, I got into a full-on, verbal, fight with a girl because I wanted to close the window in a public bathroom in January. To top it off, it was one of the snowiest winters in a long time, 2008/9, and I was in Hamburg, which is a northern port city. I just couldn't handle having my butt freeze to the toilet seat anymore. I am from the UK, Russia, the roads. I went to Moscow and St. Petersburg and the roads were terrifying. There was one that was at least 6 lanes wide and had no crossings at all. We just ran and hoped. Also, I expected Russians to be super scary and the opposite was true. I found everyone to be really friendly. Germany, efficiency. That stereotype is true. I have never had such quick service and such a good experience on a city metro. Also, the people were friendly as long as you didn't interrupt them. In London, it's very much head down and don't talk to me attitude. Italy, wonderful food all the time. It ruined eating out for me because literally everything I ate was the best version of that food I'd ever had. Also, people selling things by going right in your face. That was quite unnerving. I loved traveling though. Culture shocks are all part of the experience. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.